So hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. So today we'll be looking at the e-waste regulations in Hong Kong, of which the requirements were fully implemented in August. We'll also be taking a look at the e-waste regulations in Japan, and then I'll provide a high-level overview of the e-waste regulations in a number of other countries in Asia. I'll also explain how we can help you achieve WEEE batteries and packaging compliance at a global level. And we'll finish the webinar with a demonstration of our web-based registration and reporting platform, EC4P, before answering any questions you may have. So my name is Lisa Dean, and I'm the head of the global compliance team at ThinkStep, and I'm joined by my colleague James Pearson, who is the EC4P product manager. So in today's webinar, we'll provide you a brief introduction to our company, take a look at how regulations are changing globally, look at specific case studies of e-waste regulations in Hong Kong and Japan, and then, as I mentioned, I'll provide a brief overview of e-waste regulations in other Asian countries before explaining how we can help you achieve the WEEE batteries and packaging compliance at a global level. And then we'll provide the demonstration of EC4P before answering any questions. So to introduce you to our company, ThinkStep is a global sustainability software company. More than 2,000 companies in 20 different industry sectors rely on ThinkStep sustainability software solutions. For example, ThinkStep provides the leading lifecycle assessment software, Garby, which has 20,000 users in more than 20 different industry sectors. 40% of the global Fortune 500, such as Hewlett-Packard, Interface, Siemens, Unilever, and Volkswagen, rely on ThinkStep. The EC4P platform is part of ThinkStep. Other software solutions provided by ThinkStep include our substance declaration database, BombCheck, our product lifecycle software, Garby, and our enterprise sustainability solution, Sophie. ThinkStep's modular solutions for product compliance management integrate with Siemens product lifecycle management software, Teamcenter, to enable design for compliance across the entire product lifecycle. Siemens Teamcenter is the world's most widely used PLM system. Managing compliance within Teamcenter enables companies to integrate environmental data with their product data at each phase of the product development process, while at the same time leveraging key PLM capabilities. This integrated approach within Siemens Teamcenter leads right through to the product end of life and compliance management with global WEEE batteries and packaging recycling using ThinkStep's EC4P platform. To provide you with a brief introduction of ThinkStep's industry background, we have extensive experience in WEEE batteries, packaging, RoHS and REACH. For example, in 2003, we wrote UK government guidelines on RoHS and WEEE directives to explain practical compliance requirements to UK companies. And as you can see on the timeline, in 2007, we were the first organisation to gain authorisation to operate a UK government-approved WEEE compliance scheme, B2B WEEE scheme. We launched our global WEEE batteries and packaging services in 2013, and we've carried out these services for a number of clients to date. And in 2014, our web-based registration and reporting platform, EC4P, was established, which James will provide more detail on later in the webinar. So let's take a look at product recycling regulations in Asia. This map shows a high-level overview of the current e-waste regulations in some of the countries in Asia. Note the map doesn't highlight all of the countries in Asia that currently have e-waste regulations in place. This is purely for the purposes of the webinar, just a high-level overview. So as trading control on end-of-life electrical and electronic equipment tightens, more and more countries are implementing e-waste regulations to ensure safe management of end-of-life equipment in their country. As highlighted here, you can see that many of these regulations have been published or have been amended in the last couple of years. I'm sure you're aware of the importance for producers to monitor the changing regulatory landscape in Asia to ensure that you remain compliant in these countries. So non-compliance can potentially lead to a ban of sales in a country and other enforcement actions such as penalties and fines. So to begin with, we'll take a look at the e-waste regulations in Hong Kong. This slide shows the structure of e-waste regulations in Hong Kong and how they relate to the Producer Responsibility Scheme on WEEE, which is shown in green here. So basically, we've got the overarching Waste Disposal Ordinance, the two ordinances and the implementing regulation, which provide the regulatory framework for the Producer Responsibility Scheme on WEEE. The Waste Disposal Ordinance was enacted in 1980. It's been amended many times since. It's a framework law which provides the statutory framework for the planning, management and control of waste in Hong Kong. E-waste is mentioned in the scope of the ordinance as shown here. So the waste management system in Hong Kong operates a Producer Responsibility Scheme, or PRS. The PRS introduces the principle of polluter pays and eco-responsibility. Liable parties such as manufacturers, importers and retailers share the responsibility of reducing, reusing and recycling certain products to minimise environmental impact. The Producer Eco-Responsibility Ordinance is a framework legislation which provides the elements for all producer responsibility schemes and fundamental regulatory requirements. Operational details will be set out in the ordinance and subsidiary legislation. The legislation for WEEE Producer Responsibility Scheme, or the WPRS, was proposed in March 2015, and in March 2016 the enabling legislation for the WPRS was introduced. The Promotion of Recycling and Proper Disposal Ordinance amends the Product Eco-Responsibility Ordinance and the Waste Disposal Ordinance to provide for a WPRS. In July 2017, a further regulation, the Product Eco-Responsibility Regulated Electrical Equipment Regulation, was passed, and this specifies the operational details of the WEEE Producer Responsibility Scheme. So with the regulatory framework we've just run through in place, in February of this year, the Environmental Protection Department of Hong Kong issued a commencement notice. And in August of this year, the WEEE Producer Responsibility Scheme came into force. So who are the liable parties under the WEEE Producer Responsibility Scheme? This is the suppliers and the sellers. So suppliers are defined as general importers, authorised dealers and parallel importers, but does not include persons who are only engaged in re-export business, logistics service providers, or persons who only display equipment and are not involved in the distribution of the equipment. And sellers are defined as a person who carries out the business of distributing electrical equipment to consumers, but does not include a person who only provides service for the transporting the equipment. So this slide lists the types of equipment covered under the Producer Responsibility Scheme in Hong Kong. As you can see, there are 8 classes of electrical equipment which currently fall in scope of the regulations. Suppliers were required to register with the Environmental Protection Department, or the EPD, by the deadline of the 1st of August this year. Suppliers cannot distribute regulated electrical equipment if they are not registered with the EPD. Registered suppliers must submit quarterly declarations to the EPD and pay recycling levies based on the number of recycling labels used. These recycling labels should be provided by the supplier when distributing regulated electrical equipment. And on the side of the sellers, sellers must have a removal service plan endorsed by the EPD before they can sell regulated equipment. And sellers are also required to provide recycling labels when selling regulated equipment and a receipt containing the prescribed wording on all recycling levies. Sellers should arrange a removal service free of charge for the consumer to dispose of end-of-life equipment under the same class of equipment bought. As I mentioned in the last slide, a seller is required to have a removal service plan endorsed by the EPD before they can sell regulated equipment. The plan must include an undertaking in writing from a qualified collector to provide a collection service on behalf of the seller. And the plan should also include an undertaking in writing from qualified recyclers to provide treatment and recycling on equipment removed by the collectors. So what are the consequences of non-compliance in Hong Kong? In the information booklet for sellers, which was issued by the Hong Kong Environmental Protection Department in June of this year, it states that a person who commits an offence is liable to receive a penalty of up to 100,000 Hong Kong dollars for their first offence, and a penalty of up to 200,000 Hong Kong dollars for their second offence. There are different levels of fines for different offences. For example, if a seller fails to provide a recycling label, they can receive a fine of up to 50,000 Hong Kong dollars. So moving on to take a look at the e-waste regulations in Japan. This slide shows the framework of the e-waste regulations in Japan. We will be looking at 3 of these regulations, and these are the Law for Promotion of Effective Utilisation of Resources, the Home Appliance Recycling Law, and the Small Home Appliance Recycling Law. The Law for Promotion of Effective Utilisation of Resources creates a framework for the promotion of reduction of waste generation, the use of reusable parts, and the recycling of used products as raw materials. It was published in the year 2000 and came into force in April 2001. The law aims to promote recycling or a recycling-orientated economy by designing the industries and product categories where businesses are required to undertake 3R initiatives and giving details of voluntary actions that the industry should take. There are 69 product categories covered under the law, under 7 classifications, and each classification of products has been designated specific actions. Manufacturers of E are encouraged to rationalise the use of raw materials with the aim of reducing used products and byproducts. Manufacturers are also encouraged to use recyclable resources and reusable parts, and to promote the use of used products and byproducts as recyclable resources and reusable parts. The Home Appliance Recycling Law was established in June 1998 and enacted in April 2001. The law adopts the principle of extended producer responsibility, which extends the manufacturer's responsibility from the production stage to the whole life cycle of the product in order to ensure the proper waste treatment and efficient use of resources by reducing waste and making full use of recyclable materials. Manufacturers are required to establish their own recycling facilities or commission commercial recycling companies and achieve compulsory recycling rates. Manufacturers are also required to register their recycling take-back cycle with the government and publish the home appliance recycling fees. Under the Japanese system, manufacturers or importers are able to charge these recycling fees to retailers for recycling of used appliances taken back from the retailers. The 5 product types that fall in scope of the law are listed on this slide at the bottom. And the Act on Promotion of Recycling of Small Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment was enforced in April of 2013. The objectives of this Act are to increase home appliance recycling, use more recycled products, reduce waste, improve environmental management by the appropriate treatment of harmful materials, and reduce the environmental load of resource mining with using recyclable resources. So there are no mandatory requirements set under the Act. Instead, it encourages manufacturers to promote the collection and appropriate treatment of end-of-life small home appliances. The law covers more than 100 items of electricity or battery-powered home appliances, from which each municipality may choose the items that they collect. Although many provisions within the law for promotion of effective utilisation of resources are not technically legislated as being mandatory, in practice the requirements are in fact treated as being mandatory. So the maximum fine under this law is 500,000 yen. No fines are specified under the Home Appliance Recycling Law, but the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry can carry out inspections and order liable parties to meet compliance requirements. And under the Promotion of Recycling of Small WEEE Act, a fine of up to 300,000 yen can be issued for failing to report or making a false report or refusing inspection from a ministry official. So I'll now provide an overview of the e-waste legislation in other countries of Asia. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to cover all countries which have e-waste legislation in place, as I'm afraid we simply don't have time during this webinar. So to take a look at the regulations in China. Products which fall in scope of the China WEEE regulation are published in catalogues. The latest catalogue from 2014 includes the products listed on this slide. Currently, producers are required to pay recycling fees on 5 categories of products that they produce or import. The 5 categories of products are TVs, refrigerators, washing machines, air conditioners, and PCs. A fee is set for each type of equipment, and the payments are made into the recycling fund. Failure to comply with this regulation can result in fines of up to 500,000 yen. The Circular Economy Promotion Law takes the Chinese authorities to enact legislation to address the 3 Rs, the reduce, reuse and recycle. So the law provides a framework for initiatives to strengthen legislation in these areas. In May, we presented a webinar which covered the amendments to the e-waste legislation in India, and a recording of this webinar is available on our website, ec4p.com, and I recommend you check this out if you want more details of the requirements in India. But just to provide a brief overview, the amended e-waste management rules came into force on the 22nd of March of this year. the scope of products under the e-waste management rules are given on this slide. The scope is kind of limited to IT equipment and white goods, and a collection target for each of these types of products is given based on the average lifetime of the product. So producers are required to meet these collection targets either individually or through an authorised producer responsibility organisation, or PRO. An extended producer responsibility plan must be submitted to the Central Pollution Control Board by producers in order to gain EPR authorisation. This authorisation is required in order to be able to import and to sell products in India. Enforcement action can include up to 5 years imprisonment with a fine of up to 100,000 rupees. Moving on to Indonesia. The law on waste management is a framework law which provides a legal basis for the implementation of producer responsibility legislation. As you can see on this slide, broad categories of waste are listed under the scope of the law with no specific products mentioned. Along with the management of end-of-life packaging and products, the law mentions labelling requirements under which producers would be required to mark products with symbols related to waste reduction and handling. The national policy and strategy of the waste management of household and similar waste looks to implement provisions of the 2012 Household Waste Management Regulation through producer responsibility regulations. Under this policy, household waste is defined as waste that comes from daily activities in the household. And on to Taiwan. The Waste Disposal Act was first enacted in 1974. In 1997, an amendment to the Act established the 4-in-1 recycling programme in Taiwan. Under the Act, manufacturers and importers pay a recycling fee to the EPA in Taiwan and offer collection of waste for recycling from consumers. Producers are required to register with the EPA in Taiwan and pay recycling fees based on the quantities of new products they place on the market. There is also labelling and reporting requirements. The 4-in-1 recycling programme is designed to connect the parties which are involved in the recycling of regulated recyclable waste. And these parties are community residents, recyclers and collectors, local governments and the Recycling Fund. The Resource Recycling and Reuse Act regulates the reuse and recovery management of renewable resources. It introduces measures to improve recycling and reuse throughout the product life cycle. And enforcement action includes penalties between 60,000 and 300,000 new Taiwan dollars. And finally, to take a look at the regulations in South Korea. There are 2 regulations that enforce mandatory recycling, a mandatory recycling system in South Korea. The Act on the Promotion of Saving and Recycling of Resources, and the Act for Resource Recycling of and Automobiles. So under these regulations, producers are required to join a producer responsibility organisation or submit a mandatory recycling action plan and recycling performance report to the Ministry of Environment. Annual put on the market data is to be reported. Both professional use and consumer use products fall in scope of the regulations, and non-compliance can result in a fine of up to 30 million won. So now I'm going to hand over to James, our EC4P product manager, who can provide some information about our compliance consultancy and software services, which we've been providing to companies for well over 10 years at an EU level. and for over 3 years at a global level. James will be giving you a demonstration of EC4P's web-based registration and reporting platform.
Okay, thanks Lisa for the introduction and for the first half of today's webinar, which really had a lot of very useful information about the current landscape of e-waste legislation across Asia. So to follow on from Lisa's information slides, I'll be running the second half of today's webinar, which, as Lisa has already mentioned, will consist of a guided demo of the EC4P system. But before I switch over to the browser and start the demo, I'd just like to run through some slides which give a high-level overview of our services and of the EC4P system before we get stuck into the software functionality. So the first thing I would like to run through is a typical compliance timeline which companies should go through when they're assessing their e-waste, as well as batteries and packaging compliance obligations, and also when implementing any compliance arrangements where they're needed. So first off, you need to assess whether any product compliance legislation for e-waste or batteries and packaging has been implemented in the countries to which you are selling products. Now, the more countries you're selling into, the more complex this assessment will need to be. In countries where there is legislation in place, you then need to assess whether your products are actually in scope of that legislation. So do the regulations stipulate between consumer and professional use products? What are the e-waste categories? Are different types of batteries regulated in different ways? These are the sorts of questions you need to start asking at this point. If your products are in scope and you need, well, at that point you'll need to determine what your options are to actually implement compliance arrangements. Now, in some countries and states, there's quite a large variety of options. So if you have to join a compliance scheme, which of the available schemes is the right one for your products and sales arrangements, and which will, actually be the most cost-effective option given your situation. When you've actually put in place an authority or scheme registration for your company, you need to calculate your obligation based on the amounts of obligated products you have sold in that country, either by weight or by quantity, often both. And in addition, you might need to implement and make available a waste or recycling program plan, as is required in many countries. You'll then need to ensure you stay on top of compliance data reporting moving into the future, and you will also need to track any changes to legislation and make the associated adjustments to ensure you stay compliant. So there's really quite a lot to do to ensure a robust compliance program's in place. Now, EC4P can actually help companies through this process in two main ways. If the answer to any of the first three questions is no, then ThinkStep EC4P can monitor the regulations for you and notify you of any applicable changes in legislation which might bring your activities or products into scope. And we can do that via our quarterly compliance update. The second, and really the main way we can help companies, is to actually manage the compliance assessment and implementation process on your behalf. And over the next few slides, I hope I can show you why we're well suited to help in these areas. So the main overall benefit that EC4P can bring is to give companies an easier way to take control of product compliance with a centralized approach to compliance management. Now, the first aspect in delivering this approach is EC4P's team of expert compliance consultants. Our consultant team can quickly and accurately assess your company's obligations And as we've seen, this is dependent on sales arrangements and product types. Our team can then provide cost-effective registration and reporting solutions, and that will include a cost comparison and recommendation of the best registration option in each country, considering your products and sales arrangements into that country. In addition, our team can identify schemes which are open to unique requirements, such as overseas companies or specific industry product types. Our team can then manage the memberships to schemes going forwards. This includes completion and submission of all documentation and forms on a company's behalf where possible. EC4P can also actually pay recycling fees in each country on behalf of its customers and invoice at cost, with the benefit to the customer of only having to set up one supplier account rather than separate accounts for every registration. Our consultants can also monitor laws and regulations in any given country and notify you of changes which are applicable to your company and product range when they occur. Now, the second aspect in delivering this centralized approach is the EC4P software platform, which I will demonstrate provides a registration and data reporting summary, including a repository of all relevant documentation and contracts. It also displays all upcoming reporting deadlines specific to your company. Now, considering many of these these deadlines have different reporting periods and different deadline dates, this can be a really valuable management tool. EC4P will then chase users for data via email notifications as the deadlines approach. It will check that users have entered data in the correct format, and it will then issue compliance certificates which list the countries and associated regulations which a company has maintained compliance with using EC4P. And we found these compliance certificates can be used as a very efficient way that companies can communicate compliance with the likes of national authorities, auditors, and to your customers who may ask for evidence of product recycling compliance. Okay, so now that we have a bit of background about our services and an overview of our software system, I'll actually move on to the demo itself. Now, to be able to effectively demo the software functionality, we've set up an example account for a company called Acme Electronics. Now, this company can be thought of as an electronics manufacturer selling products into many countries around the world, and who are using EC4P to achieve product compliance in those countries. So I'll now head over to ec4p.com and get started.